If you ask most people where America's true global power comes from, they'll point to nuclear arsenals, aircraft carrier strike groups, or Silicon Valley tech titans. But the ultimate weapon of modern geopolitics wasn't forged in a military lab or coded in a corporate campus. It was drafted inside an isolated luxury hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire during the summer of 1944. The year was 1944. World War II was entering its final, catastrophic phase. Europe was physically and financially destroyed, its cities turned to rubble, its industrial infrastructure flattened, and its national treasuries completely emptied by years of total war. Across Asia, similar devastation reigned. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, the United States occupied a position unprecedented in human history. Unscathed by domestic bombing campaigns and functioning as the arsenal of democracy, America held nearly 80% of the entire world's monetary gold reserves in its vaults. In July of that year, 730 delegates from 44 allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. Their task was staggering: construct an entirely new global monetary architecture from the ashes of war. The British delegation, led by legendary economist John Maynard Keynes, argued passionately for a neutral, global reserve currency, an international unit of account called the Bancor that no single nation could control or manipulate for its own national interest. But the American delegation, led by senior Treasury official Harry Dexter White, held all the cards. America had the factories, the armies, and, most importantly, the gold. White systematically shut down the British proposal. Instead, the United States imposed a system where the US dollar would become the world's sole primary reserve currency. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, all other major world currencies, the British pound, the French franc, the German mark, the Japanese yen, were pegged directly to the US dollar at fixed exchange rates. The dollar, in turn, was backed by physical gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. To the war-weary world, this arrangement looked like a golden promise of permanent financial stability. Foreign governments no longer needed to haul heavy gold bars across oceans to settle international trade debts. They could simply hold paper greenbacks, confident in the legally binding guarantee that those paper dollars could be redeemed at the US Federal Reserve for real gold at any moment. Unbeknownst to the world, this treaty quietly established an invisible financial empire. Foreign nations were forced to accumulate dollars to purchase essential global commodities like oil, steel, and grain. The United States had effectively transformed itself into the central banker of planet Earth. For the first 15 years, the system delivered an unprecedented economic boom. Rebuilding Europe required massive capital, and American dollars flowed across the globe, funding the Marshall Plan and driving global trade. But deep within the DNA of the Bretton Woods system laid a fatal structural contradiction, a mathematical paradox known as the Triffin dilemma. Named after Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin, Triffin pointed out a terrifying flaw: to supply the growing global economy with enough liquidity to trade, the United States had to continually print and export dollars to foreign nations. But to export those dollars, America was forced to run perpetual trade deficits, spending more money abroad than it earned at home. The paradox was inescapable. The more dollars America printed to supply world trade, the more it diluted its gold backing. By the late 1960s, the illusion was collapsing. America was funding the massive military expenditures of the Vietnam War and expanding domestic welfare programs by wildly expanding the dollar supply. The number of paper dollars circulating around the globe began to far exceed the physical gold sitting inside Fort Knox. The monetary trap was officially set, and the global economy was locked into a system destined for a historic default. By 1970, the tension beneath the international monetary framework had reached a boiling point. Central bankers across Europe were watching the Federal Reserve's balance sheet with growing alarm. They realized that Washington was printing mountains of unbacked paper currency to fund its geopolitical ambitions, effectively exporting American domestic inflation to every corner of the globe. French President Charles de Gaulle was the first major world leader to publicly call out the trick. De Gaulle correctly identified the arrangement as an exorbitant privilege, a system where the United States could print paper out of thin air to purchase real, physical wealth, machinery, and corporations from other countries, while foreign nations had to perform hard physical labor to earn those same dollars. De Gaulle decided to test the validity of the Bretton Woods guarantee. He ordered the French Navy to load warships with accumulated paper US dollar reserves, send them across the Atlantic to New York Harbor, and demand physical gold bullion directly from the Federal Reserve vaults. It was a geopolitical game of chicken. Other sovereign nations quickly recognized the impending panic. Spain, Germany, and Switzerland began quietly converting their dollar holdings back into gold. Between 1959 and 1971, the gold reserves of the United States fell by a staggering 50%. The vaults at Fort Knox were draining at a rate that threatened total financial collapse. By August 1971, the situation turned critical. The British ambassador approached the US Treasury with an urgent request. The United Kingdom wanted to convert 3 billion paper dollars into physical gold immediately. The US Treasury simply did not have enough gold to cover the demand. The bank run on America had begun. On Friday afternoon, August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon met secretly at Camp David with his top financial advisors, including Treasury Secretary John Connally and Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns. They knew the truth. If America honored its international obligations, its entire remaining gold reserve would vanish within weeks, bankrupting the country. On Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, President Nixon took to national television, preempting the popular broadcast of Bonanza. In an address to the nation, Nixon announced a series of emergency economic measures. Buried in the middle of his speech was a momentous declaration. The United States was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Nixon assured the public that this was a brief administrative adjustment to protect the dollar from foreign speculators. But it wasn't temporary. It was the largest default in recorded economic history. With the stroke of a pen, the final physical tether holding money to tangible reality was severed. The Bretton Woods Agreement was dead. For the first time in human history, every major national currency on planet Earth was converted simultaneously into pure fiat money currency backed by nothing more than government decree, legal enforcement, and public confidence. Without the gold standard acting as an absolute brake on money creation, central banks were suddenly granted godlike powers. Governments could now borrow unlimited sums of money. National debts could expand endlessly, and the slow, relentless erosion of public purchasing power was transformed from a temporary economic glitch into a permanent structural feature of modern life. In the immediate aftermath of Nixon's 1971 announcement, the US dollar went into a tailspin. Free from its gold anchor, the currency plummeted in value on international markets. Global inflation exploded, and foreign nations began actively discussing abandoning the dollar altogether in favor of new trade mechanisms. The American financial empire was on the verge of total collapse. Washington needed a replacement anchor, something every industrialized country on Earth needed even more than gold. That anchor was energy. The opportunity presented itself in October 1973 during the Arab-Israeli War. In response to Western support for Israel, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, enacted a sweeping oil embargo against Western nations. Oil prices quadrupled overnight, paralyzing Western economies, causing massive lines at gas stations, and plunging the global financial system into stagflation. Recognizing the existential threat, President Nixon and his national security team orchestrated a geopolitical masterpiece. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to conduct a series of ultra-secret negotiations with the Saudi royal family. The deal Kissinger presented was simple, elegant, and ruthless. The United States promised absolute, unconditional military protection to the House of Saud. America would guarantee the survival of the monarchy, supply state-of-the-art military hardware, and protect Saudi oil fields from regional rivals or internal uprisings. In return, King Faisal agreed to non-negotiable conditions. First, Saudi Arabia, the undisputed leader of the OPEC cartel, would price all of its oil exports exclusively in United States dollars. No foreign buyer, whether German, Japanese, or French, could purchase Saudi crude using their own national currency. They were forced to acquire US dollars first. Second, Saudi Arabia would take its massive surplus oil profits, known as petrodollars, and invest them directly back into US Treasury bonds, effectively financing American government debt. By 1975, every single member of OPEC had agreed to the exact same terms. The petrodollar system was born. This agreement transformed the global economy. It created an artificial, mandatory global demand for paper greenbacks. It no longer mattered that the dollar wasn't backed by gold. It was now backed by the lifeblood of modern industrial civilization, oil. If a country wanted to heat its homes, fuel its transport, or run its factories, It was forced to export real physical goods, labor, and resources to the United States just to obtain paper dollars. This system granted Washington an extraordinary financial shield. It allowed the U.S. government to run massive, perpetual deficits, spend trillions on military campaigns around the globe, and accumulate tens of trillions in national debt, all while exporting its domestic monetary inflation directly to foreign nations. However, the petrodollar system required strict enforcement. History shows that any foreign nation attempting to sell oil in currencies other than the dollar found itself facing severe consequences ranging from crippling economic sanctions to direct military intervention. The petrodollar was not merely an economic agreement, it was the geopolitical foundation of modern empire. While the petrodollar secured global hegemony abroad, a silent, mathematical extraction was unfolding inside domestic economies. Most people view inflation as a mysterious natural phenomenon, a random increase in the price of food, housing, energy, and healthcare. But inflation is not an act of God. It is a direct mathematical outcome of increasing the supply of currency faster than the supply of goods and services. When central banks create new units of currency out of thin air to purchase government bonds or bail out failing corporate conglomerates, that newly printed money does not distribute itself evenly across society. This brings us to a crucial economic principle known as the Cantillon Effect. Named after 18th century French-Irish economist Richard Cantillon, Cantillon observed that when a government prints new money, the individuals and institutions closest to the money printer benefit the most, while those furthest away suffer the damage. The entities closest to the printer, central banks, major commercial banking institutions, defense contractors, government agencies, and massive private equity funds receive the newly printed currency first. They spend this fresh money at its original, undevalued purchasing power, using it to acquire real, physical assets, prime real estate, stocks, infrastructure, and commodities. As that newly printed currency circulates deeper into the broader economy, it expands the overall money supply and drives up the price of goods. By the time that money finally reaches ordinary working citizens in the form of wages, prices across the economy have already surged. The average citizen receives devalued money that buys far less than it used to. This creates a continuous, invisible transfer of wealth. Since the final severance of the gold standard in 1971, wage growth for average workers has remained virtually flat when adjusted for real inflation. Meanwhile, asset prices, real estate, stock indexes, and luxury holdings have skyrocketed to historic highs. This explains why middle-class families today find it increasingly difficult to achieve home ownership, pay for higher education, or build lasting savings. Despite working longer hours and maintaining multiple jobs, their savings are sitting in commercial bank accounts where interest rates fail to keep pace with the real rate of monetary expansion. The system inherently penalizes savers and rewards debt-fueled asset hoarders. The monetary machine doesn't just manage the currency, it functions as a quiet mechanism that drains purchasing power from the working class and funnels real physical assets straight to the top of the financial pyramid. We are now witnessing the final, unstable chapter of the global monetary order established 8 decades ago. The very weapons used by Western powers to enforce dollar dominance are now accelerating its decline. In early 2022, following the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, Western nations executed an unprecedented financial move. They froze over $300 billion worth of Russian sovereign central bank reserves held in Western accounts. While intended as a decisive penalty, the move sent a shockwave through international finance. Central bankers across Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa realized a terrifying reality. If your sovereign wealth is held in US dollars or inside Western financial networks, your national reserves can be confiscated overnight if your foreign policy strays from Washington's interests. This weaponization of the dollar sparked a global push toward de-dollarization, a coalition of emerging market economies known as BRICS, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now rapidly expanding across the Middle East, is constructing an alternative financial infrastructure. These nations are aggressively settling trade in local currencies, establishing non-Western payment systems, and purchasing physical gold at the fastest pace recorded in modern history. Saudi Arabia has officially declared its willingness to trade oil in non-dollar currencies, effectively dismantling the core arrangement of the 1974 Petrodollar Compact. In response to this shifting landscape, Global central banks are preparing their ultimate monetary transition, central bank digital currencies, or CBSES. Unlike decentralized digital assets or physical cash, a CBD is a direct digital liability of the central bank. It grants monetary authorities absolute, real-time control over every financial transaction within a nation. Under a fully implemented CBD framework, central planners could impose negative interest rates, program expiration dates on money to force spending, restrict specific purchases, and instantly freeze accounts of non-compliant citizens. The dollar trap is approaching its logical conclusion. A financial architecture built on infinite debt, unbacked currency, and forced global compliance is confronting physical and mathematical realities. However, history proves that every major monetary transition creates profound opportunities for those who understand the game. Protecting yourself requires moving away from pure cash dependency, understanding real economic history, acquiring hard tangible assets, and developing true financial sovereignty. The power of the monetary trap relies entirely on public ignorance. Illuminating its mechanics is where real financial independence begins.